All right. So as we've been going through the quarter, we've been going through the book of James. This week, it would be week 10 of 12. So after this lesson, we'll have two more to go through. As we've been going through, we've been trying to go through it pretty, I say slowly, but very intentionally. I think there's just a lot to unpack in the book of James. So this week we'll be studying the first six verses rather, in James as we discuss riches. But before we go on any further, I want to look back and just kind of set the tone for what we looked at last week. Last week we looked at James, the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 17. As far as the amount of verses, it was not as many as we have done in the past, but still quite a bit of content packed into there. So we looked at verses 13 through 17. Really the key theme that we looked at last week was the problem of plans. He pointed out James certainly does not have a problem with us making plans, but the problem that we can run into oftentimes is when we make plans that are apart from God or without God being considered. Even to the point where we would get so specific as we would say things like, today or tomorrow we would go such a town, spend a year there, trade, and make profit. And James points out that, again, while planning is not wrong, whenever we do it with certain motives or without certain motives, I should say, without God in our within our plans, then that's when things start to go awry, because we start to have this feeling or start to have this sense of pride when we have this control. And James reminds us that we are not really in control of our lives. I mean, even our best laid plans can sometimes go outside of what we for what we do. And so it's something that he brings to mind and really challenges us to, as we make plans, to do so with God in mind, not to separate, not to have God in one box of our lives and then our plans and the things that we do in the other part, but if God truly is at the center of our lives, and He is going to be at the center of our plans. And so we concluded with that last week. So again, just to kind of give you some review there. As we went through this week, and as I was studying and prepping, I think of all the things that James is going to talk about. This was probably the one that I felt most uncomfortable with, simply because of I feel like he's talking to us, and I'll kind of elaborate that in just a little bit. But I do want to go ahead and start with reading James chapter 5 verses 1 through 6. If someone could read that, and then we'll start getting into some of the uncomfortable things I think that James is pointing out, some uncomfortable warnings that he provides. Anybody want to read? Volunteer?
Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of a slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you.
Thank you for reading that, Chris. Like I said, this was a very uncomfortable passage for me to read, mainly because I would always think when I read this passage that James was talking to somebody else. When I consider rich, like in my estimation, rich to me is Bill Gates, like those type of people, like the top 1% of the 1%. Or it's like when I think of rich, those are the people I inherently think of. But as I've done some research into this, and just in some things that I have discovered over the past few years, just in my life, while yes, Bill Gates is rich, and Tim Cook and all these these successful business people that we read about and see, rich, being rich is not so far off from what we see in our lives. So I want to, and I put this in our handout. Sorry, this is a little small, but I want you to consider this. So according to Randy Alcorn, he is the author of a book called Money, Possessions, and Eternity. And keep this in mind, this was an older book. I think it was about 20 years old, I think was the copyright on this. He said, if you made $1,500 last year, you're considered in the top 20% of the world's income earners. $1,500 in a year. That's not in a month. That's not in a week. That's in a year. Okay. He said, if you made $1,500 cumulative last year, you're in the top 20% of the world's income earners. He said, if you have sufficient food, decent clothes, live in a house or an apartment, and have a reasonable and reliable or reasonably reliable means of transportation, you are among the top 15% of the world's wealthy. And he goes on to say, if you have money saved, a hobby that requires some equipment or supplies, a variety of clothes in your closet, 2 cars, and that can be in any condition, new, used, banged up, whatnot, live in your own home, you are in the top 5% of the world's wealthy. That was a shock to me. And I can remember, I think Jake had done a talk in preparation for a collection once, and he talked about, that the vast majority of the world, I can't remember what the percent, and Jake, you may be able to comment on the percentage, but there was an absurd percentage of people in the world that did not have a car, that actually do have a car versus did not have a car. And most Americans don't just have 1 car, but they have 2 cars to their names in households. And so, Jake, do you remember what the stat was? Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
it was a little while. It was before COVID, so it was a while ago.
Yes, it was like, I believe, over 90%. It was some crazy number. Think about the people that don't have vehicles.
Mm-hmm. And so it's just, this to me, when James is talking here, and I'm looking at weeping and howling and all these things, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of, he's talking to me. And that's something, that we need to consider, because I think, I'm comfortable saying this, but I believe that we are far richer than those that James is specifically writing to in the letter. And so I feel like it's something that we need to pay close attention to as we do that. So I want you, as we look at this, James begins this section with a very, very strong warning, probably one of the strongest that he's given to the book. Who is this warning that he is providing? Who is he warning in this, in the first 6 verses? I've already said it, but I'll throw a softball for everybody. Who's he warning?
Rich people.
Rich people. Is this the first time that we read in Scripture of warnings against the rich, or warnings towards the rich, or towards money or riches or things like that? Is this the first time that we read about this?
No.
And you're right. No, I looked and I found just in a brief search, there is a lot that Jesus specifically says and talks about against riches. Timothy does this, or Paul says this to Timothy: for the love of money is roots of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pangs. Now, obviously, money is not the source of evil, but it's the love of that. But some people may say, well, I don't have enough money to love, so therefore I don't love money. But that can be, you can still love money and not have it. But that's something that Paul warns Timothy about. Jesus says this, he says, no servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. He says, you cannot serve God and money. And I think that's a real hard line to I guess ride there, because some people want to serve both, and there is a tendency and a temptation to try, and Jesus makes it very clear you cannot do those 2 things. In the parable of the sower, Jesus describes in Luke 8:14, says, the seed which fell among the thorns, he said, these are the ones who have heard the word, and as they go on their way, they are choked. And notice what they're choked with. He says, the worries and the riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to maturity. So there is a warning here that Jesus said, that Jesus talks about in this parable, that the that those who fall on thorns, and the word is literally choked out of them, a very strong word, that are choked out of them. Things like worries, riches, and pleasures of this life can do that to certain people. Matthew 19:21-22 says, if you wish to be complete, talking to a rich man who came to him, Jesus said, go and sell your possessions, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. So when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving because he owned much property. And he goes on, this is Mark's account, but you just see this, you just see the hyperbole that Jesus is talking here. He says, children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. And what's really interesting is that's obviously a shocking statement to the people who heard it, because listen to what his disciples say next. He says, and they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, then who can be saved? If the rich can't get into heaven, then how can the poor? Or how can a guy like me? And Jesus looked at them and said, with man, yes, that's impossible, but with God, but not with God, for all things are possible with God. And so we see this theme throughout Scripture, and we see this throughout the ministry of Jesus, is that he's talking a lot about riches and how dangerous they can be to those who have it. It's not that a rich man can't enter the kingdom of heaven, but the difficulty there is so much greater than someone who does not have those riches and does have that temptations. And so when I look at this passage, I know I've probably beat this over with a dead horse as we introduce this, but I want you to take the concept of that he is talking to you and he is talking to me. Yes, he is certainly talking to the Jews that he's writing to, but I want you to put yourself in these shoes, because we are just as easily in this. And we can certainly be tempted by this in our culture and just with the amount of things that we have. So sorry for the long-winded introduction, but I really want to make that point because this is, and I think this is probably stepping on my toes more so than anything. But this is something I think we all, especially as Americans, need to hear. But notice what he says. He says, now come, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Why does James say this? I mean, like that's pretty strong words, James. Why does he say this? Weep and howl for the miseries that have come upon you. I mean, they're rich people, right? Rich people don't howl. Rich people don't weep. Rich people don't have misery, right? Why does he say this?
Daniel, don't the Jews have a misguided approach that you were blessed if you were rich? I mean, I think that goes back to Job and some to Abraham. And they always thought that would show God's favor to you if you were wealthy. So this is a different idea that they're being exposed to, that wealth is not a sign of God's love for you, but rather is something that you need to use to help and serve others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I had read this, but there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees were often at odds because of their view on the resurrection. One of the things that the Sadducees would subscribe to was they were often very rich, and Pharisees were too, but Sadducees were often very rich because they had this viewpoint that if there was no resurrection, if there was no life after death, God's favor to you or his approval of you is in the way that he blessed you. And they would look at like Job and things like that. If God would bless you in this life because he has found favor, so you must be doing something right if you have a lot of riches. And that's how the Sadducees would look at that too, is because if there's no resurrection, then if this is all this life has to offer, then if I have riches, if I am wealthy and well off, then it must be a sign that God is happy with me. And so I need to continue what it is that I'm doing. And so you're right. The Jews had this viewpoint that there was a connection between wealth and God's favor with that. But what do you see that typically happens when you are wealthy, or when you have? I mean, this can be followers of Jesus. This can be people in the world. What is the tendency that we have when we amass up so much stuff and so much wealth? What is the tendency that we have whenever we do that? Whenever we gain power or riches?
I think it gives us a false sense of security, and I think that's one of the biggest risks of wealth is that wealthy people. That's because, you know, I wrestle with this too, is this idea of like, you know, to Taryn's point, you know, God blesses us and we're intend to bless other people, and it's how we use it. But what happens is a lot of rich people, in the general sense, the more and more you gain, the more and more power and influence you acquire, the less and less you feel like you're held responsible to anybody but yourself. And it gives you a false sense of security that, you know, I am somebody, I am important, and I have the ability to be different, to treat people differently. And, you know, like this guy he's talking about, right? This guy that we're going to be talking about, these rich people that don't pay their laborers and hold things back and are fraudulent. Because, I mean, I think it goes right back to the back end of chapter 4 about talking about people who make plans, right? Plans aren't evil. Being rich isn't evil, but it gives us, it's that false sense of security and putting our hope in things that aren't spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it reminds me of King Nebuchadnezzar. Right before God, you know, humbled him for the amount of time that he was. He said, you know, he goes on this. They have this discourse where he walks out on his balcony and says, "Look at what I've done. Like, look at all these things that I've created and done for these things." And then, like, you know, in an instance, he goes from being the ruler of the world to eating, you know, grass in a field. And so I think like to your point, riches and power really give us that false sense of security that we've done something, and can really inflate our sense of pride and our sense of ego if the things that we're blessed with are we're being used for ourselves. What's really interesting is as he goes, he says, "Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire." Let me ask you something. When is it that you typically see like your riches rot or moth-eaten? I think of like clothes. My parents growing up, they would fill our closets with mothballs because they didn't want your clothes to get eaten up by moths. But I hated the smell. Anyone else's parents do that, or any of y'all do that?
Oh yeah.
My parents always did that, and my clothes always smelled like mothballs. But it was to keep, you know, those things from rotting. But when do you typically see your riches or your excess rot over time?
When you're not using it.
Exactly. When you're not using it. Same principle. Typically, you know, silver and gold don't typically corrode, but when you typically see those things, if they corrode, this occurs when we don't use it. If you don't use something, it's going to break down and decay. And that often happens when you see this, when you have so much wealth or so many things that you honestly can't keep track of it all. You know, we have so many clothes that we can't wear them all, so they rot. We have so much silver and gold that they can't be spent, so it sits and it erodes. And it's this concept of we have so much that we can't even use the things that we have because we have so much. This caused me to ask this question in my life: do I have things like that, or have I had things in my life that fit this description? So many like things that I haven't used in a long time. And have gotten so worn, or I've not used it for so long, it begins to break down and I end up having to throw away. Maybe you see this a lot if you've ever cleaned out a closet or cleaned out a garage or cleaned out a shed. Have you ever had to do that before? I can tell you when we moved, we noticed this when we moved. There was so much stuff that we were able to donate, thankfully, but there was a lot of stuff we had to throw away because we didn't use it. Like some of the stuff that was either not unuseful to us or trash or corroded or not used. And there was a lot of that. I'm sure you guys, have y'all experienced that in a move or whenever you're spring cleaning and you like go through your clothes or go through your closet or a shed or something like that? Have y'all ever experienced that before?
Absolutely. And you got to get rid of it. I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not good anymore to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, you can take this to the extreme. Have you ever seen that show Hoarders? You see those people who where this is really a niche for them. You go in their house and you can't really go anywhere because you can't find a place to step. You know, I think James is kind of giving us this picture of hoarding, someone who continues to accumulate so much stuff that they don't even know what to do with it anymore because they don't even know what they have. It's gotten lost and forgotten and it wears down. and as James moves to the second part of I think it's verse 2, he says, and there it says, the gold and silver has been corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you and eat your flesh like fire. I mean, great word picture. It's a great analogy you want to look at. It's something that we all definitely want to aspire to, have our stuff eat our flesh like fire, right? But what he does is he paints this. I guess let me back up. What picture do you think he's painting when you say something like evidence, that these things are going to be evidence against you? What do you typically think of when you think of like evidence and against you and those kinds of words? What do you think of?
Judgment.
Mm-hmm. Judgment.
Trial.
A trial. Absolutely, Danny. I think of a courtroom. I think of a courtroom scene. I think of a judgment scene. I think of us coming before the judge and looking at the things that we have, and then being put on trial. The things that we would have considered assets in our life have now become liabilities. The things that we have looked at that give us a lot of things have now become something that has been used, that would be used against them. And I want you to think about, that for yourself for a moment, as you're inventorying maybe the things in your mind that you have, imagine like the things that you thought were a blessing being used against you in judgment. As I think about that caused me to think, well, maybe I should think twice before I purchase something, or maybe I need to get rid of some things before I purchase more. These blessings have been turned into condemnation against them. It reminds me of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. When he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. He says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. And so James, just like Jesus, and we talked about this before, where James will get a lot of the things that Jesus has talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. He pulls a lot of those ideas here. And I think I think that may be what James is thinking about when he's talking about this, is that, he's pointing to a heart of the matter. He's describing a person who is focused on his treasure more than anything else, so much so that in the last days, and you look at this, he says, you have laid up treasure in the last days in verse 3. This type of person is so focused on what they can get that even in their last days, they are focused on building up treasures here versus treasures in heaven. And that's a scary thing to even be in a point where you're in your last days, close to death or closer to death than you were to living. And that's still your priority. That's still your focus. So I think that's something that, for me is a little scary.
Hey, Daniel.
To me. Yes, sir.
And I know this may sound silly, but with it being Christmas time, we've been watching a lot of Christmas movies, and the kids have really gotten into the Christmas carols. We've probably watched like 3 or 4 different versions of the Christmas Carol, and it's really funny, when I read this passage, how much it kind of hit, like, the kids kind of saw a visual representation of not using your wealth the right way, and talking about like when Marley shows up and he's got all these chains and these boxes and it represented all the things that he didn't use his money for in the proper way, and how Scrooge was so tight with the money and didn't want to help anyone out and things like that. And I couldn't help but think about that verse 3 that we were just reading about, when talk about the corrosion being used as evidence against you, like your riches and your lack of use of your riches, that will be evidence, that'll be part of your judgment. And I thought, first thing I thought about, just because I've seen it so much, is that visual, how visually that the Christmas Carol really shows that, and made the kids really at least understand it.
See, everybody, you didn't know that Charles Dickens was such a James fan. Maybe he read that before as he did that. So it's when I was thinking about, it's funny you mentioned that, Jake. As I was reading and preparing for it, one of the things that I had read was like, this is like the picturesque of Ebenezer Scrooge, and like this is like this is the picture perfect, or the representation of that. And so, that's a perfect illustration, perfect time of year to be bringing this to be bringing this up. and it's what's interesting is kind of how James can continue. I say interesting a lot, but as James moves forward into verse 4, we see kind of how this thought and how this particular person is so focused on his riches, and notice the input or the output that it does, and the impact that it has on other people. This is not just something that is internal with this rich man. It's something that's external, that's going out. And so listen to what he says here. He says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which kept you back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." These are the actions of the rich person. Like everything in his life is focused on his riches. And again, laying up for himself treasures on earth, to the point that he is willing to exploit, to take advantage of, to use other people to gain more riches. It doesn't just stop at him and his pursuit. His pursuit is now impacting other people. And that's going to go contrary to what James has been encouraging us and challenging us to do in earlier chapters. This person has defrauded people, used them to gain more and more. He's exploited the poor by not paying them for their labors. And so at ancient times, and I think we've seen this before in some of the parables that Jesus has explained to us. In ancient times, payment for work performed was due at the end of the workday. So, right, typically now we will work and you get paid for the last 2 weeks of labor that you've done. Typically, most people get paid twice a month. In ancient times, they would get the people would get paid at the end of the day for work that they performed for that day. So we see this in the parable of the workers in the vineyards, where we had like 3 sets of people come to work and they all got paid the same, even though some worked longer than others. But some landowners, what they would do, they were so greedy that they would have the poor work in these times, and they would either withhold payment for services rendered, or they would hold back a portion of it. And notice who suffers in that. It's the poor people. What can the poor person do? They're poor. Like they have to rely on this person to pay them what they're earned. And so there's a trust there. And this rich person is so focused on himself and so focused on the riches that he's gaining, is that he's gonna exploit people. They didn't, during these times, they didn't have things like, federal minimum wage or contracts to ensure the working party received payment. And I think what's more shocking than this is apparently there were, like, some of the people that James is writing to were guilty of this. Some of the Christians, it sounds like, may have been guilty of this, which I think is, to me, is shocking. So it's something that, I think you'd be shocked if you said, hey, there's a Christian that I know who does this. But apparently James is writing to people who were guilty of this, who were rich to the point that they exploited other people to get what they wanted. And he says, James says, the cries of this injustice have been heard by God, and now he is ready to settle accounts. Does that remind you of a particular parable that Jesus talked about in his ministry?
Sounds like the ungrateful servant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's this idea that, like I said, the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Like, these things don't go quiet. These things aren't going to be swept underneath the rug, or these things are not going to ever be brought to light. These are things that if you engage in this activity, this will come against you. Again, assets that become now liabilities. The cries of the cries of the harvesters have now reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. It reminds me of this. And you probably did this whenever you were young, if you had siblings. Did you ever get in trouble? Like you did something to your brother and you knew what you did was wrong, and then you're like, Chris shakes his head like, no, I've never done that before. But you did something against your brother and you're like, don't tell mom, please don't tell dad. Did you ever have that growing up? I did, at least a few times. Like, I did not want what I did against my brother to get to my ears of my dad or my mom, because I knew I was going to be in for a whooping. And so you try to bribe your brothers, and you try to like say, hey, don't say anything, please, and this could be like, I accidentally, hit my brother in the face and there's blood coming down from him. Like, please don't tell mom, don't tell mom. Like, how are you going to miss that? There's blood pouring down your face. So there's these, I feel like this is kind of the same thing, that there's this fraud that's happening, and you don't want this to get to God's ears, but he says, regardless, that's what it's going to be. The cries of the injustice have been heard by God, and now he is ready to settle the account for that. And that's not something that the rich who engage in this are going to be wanting God to settle. Any questions or comments before we move on to the next verse, next part? Quiet tonight. Finishing in verses 5 and 6, James says, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. We learn in verse 5, I think, kind of a heart issue that we start to see of the rich person. We see the type of person this individual is. It's a self-indulgent person. Can anyone provide me I'll say a layman's terms definition of self-indulgent? What does it mean to be self-indulgent?
Always thinking about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it says these rich are living in luxury. As you said earlier, and Jake, as others have said, he's not condemning being rich, but he's condemning how he's using his riches and how he obtained his riches. He's living in luxury while at the same time defrauding those who are making him rich, his laborers who are working for him. And it all goes back to the idea of loving money. Your love for money is what's causing all of this. And he is indulging in anything and everything he wanted to do. Solomon experimented with this. He may have been the richest man that's ever lived on earth, but it seems like he understood and had the right attitude toward riches. The women was his downfall, but he learned, he said, he who loves silver will never be satisfied with silver. Mm-hmm. And we can't even count the amount of riches he obtained every year while on this earth. But he did indulge himself to experiment with all these things to learn what life is all about. And it seems like he learned what it was all about, the true meaning of life. And that's putting God first instead of putting yourself first.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Dan. Thanks for bringing that up. One of the definitions of self-indulgence is this idea of excessive and unrestrained gratifications of one's own appetites, desires, or whims. And you notice, he says you lived on the earth in luxury and you have lived in self-indulgence. So you've lived in this way where you have excessively and in unrestrained gratified yourself and one's own appetites. And it's a great point that you brought up that Solomon has done that. There's someone who's been far richer than anyone that most likely in history. Had everything he could ever want and still come to the conclusion that that's not enough. Silver and gold are not enough to satisfy. But you see someone who can really get lost in that and really get lost in this unrestrained gratification. Just think about that, like the lack of restraint in gratifying your desires and your appetites, this lack of self-control, this lack of self-discipline. And you see this in a variety of people who get lost in that, who have zero self-control, can quickly go down a very deep, a dark path. And I think that's what you see here. I think you see someone who's gone down that path, and you see some of the results as you fatten your heart in a day of slaughter. Something, we kind of talked about this, something you would consider a blessing has now become a curse to you. When you think of like fattening up a pig or fattening up a calf for the day of slaughter, that's something to be celebrated. That's something to look forward to. That's something to enjoy because you're enjoying the fruit of your labor, which certainly is not right. But in this case, or certainly not wrong, but in this case, he's saying you've become that self-fulfilling prophecy. You have fattened your own self up in the day of slaughter and the day of judgment. That's something that he's inadvertently doing this to himself. And you see this God person says, you said you've condemned and murdered the righteous person and he does not resist you. We talk about the impact that a self-indulgent person has. He will go to great lengths and to any lengths to get what he wants. This person does exactly the opposite of care for someone. He exploits them. And this is completely contrary to what we have read in James up to this point. We think about in James chapter 1 and verse 27, when he explains that we are to help those who are helpless. We are to help the fatherless. We are to help the widows, not exploit them, not gain from them. The point of riches is not to be self-indulgent with them. The point of the things that God provides us is to help other people, is to share these things. Because they're blessings to us so we can bless other people in different ways. And it reminds me of what James said in what we talked about last week in chapter 4, verse 17. If we know what the right thing to do is and we don't do it, what is it?
Sin.
It's sin. Yeah, it's sin. We've been told in this letter to help those who can't help themselves. And if we fail to do this, if we have the means of which to help somebody and we don't do it, that's sin, according to James. It's this idea that, that I think he's getting at is how can we as God's people focus on storing up more treasure on earth when we have people in need now? And think about that. That's something that, that's a temptation. That's something that we've got that as Americans, that's something that is a challenge for us because of just, like I said, our culture. But he's pointing out that, that's something that we need to consider as we're storing up treasure. Where is that treasure? Where are we storing treasure? Are we doing it here? Or are we doing it for heaven? When I think of how James concludes this section, he says, "You've condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." Can you think of an example in the Bible where the righteous suffered because of a rich man trying to exploit them, or was self-indulgent to the point where the righteous or someone else was negatively impacted by that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you.
You said the vineyard. Ahab's vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
Naboth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Vineyard.
That was the one I thought of. And if you remember that story, this is in 1 Kings chapter 21. Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. Wanted it so bad, like he pouted about it when he couldn't get it. He tried to buy it for a large sum of money. Naboth said, "No, it's been in my family. I don't want to sell that." So he cries and Jezebel hears him, and so Jezebel ends up essentially murdering Naboth for it. And Ahab's pursuit of more treasure led to a righteous man's, Naboth's, death. The righteous ones are the ones who often suffer in the wake of a rich person's self-indulgence. And that's a scary thing. And have you seen that? Do you see that today? Do you see people the rich exploiting people who are less fortunate, or the righteous people getting in the way of someone's self-indulgence?
Certainly. Mm-hmm. Without going into politics.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you see it, it's not just in politics. I mean, you see it in corporate America. The things that companies will do to save money, oftentimes have a negative effect on their employees. You see that in corporate America a lot of times. You see this and we may not see this particular way in America, but in certain countries, where there's no laws that prohibit companies from doing things. You have rulers or people who still own other people that do this same kind of thing. It's something that that can go unchecked. But James reminds us that it won't go unchecked forever. And so that's something that stands out to me. As I kind of transition to application, I think we learned something about God in this passage. Maybe that we've known before, but I think we learned something about God in this passage, and that's God does not tolerate his people taking advantage of others. He certainly does not condone that. Christians who are rich have an opportunity and a responsibility to help those who are in need. And James, we can see, is really consistent with the way that he is warning those who are rich because of this temptation, because of this tendency that people had. He's very consistent in this because his whole premise is, if God has changed your heart, it's going to impact every other part of your life. So to take that and to put it in this context, regardless of what money we have or don't have, if God has changed your heart, it's going to impact the way you look at your finances. To kind of backtrack to what we've done before, if God has changed your heart, it's going to change the way you plan. It's going to change your perspective on the world around you. It's going to change the way you talk. It's going to change what you do. It's going to change the way you treat other people. It's going to change the way you listen to others. It's going to change the way you approach temptation. It's going to change the way you approach trials. And he's very consistent up at this point. If God moves into your life, if God is changing, if God's word is changing your heart, everything about your life then changes with it. And so I think that's something that James really has hammered all the way through this. These are not an actions issue; these are a heart issue. And so it really causes me to consider the things that I have, the things that I want, the things that I purchase, and what my view is on that, how I use the things that I'm given. Am I self-indulgent in the things that I gravitate towards? I brought this question to in the handout. I actually over my screen here. This is actually a question I will say that I stole from someone else or from something else. But if you write down, if you examine your household budget and you look at your expenditures, how do your expenditures reflect your spiritual priorities? Or if I write down the top 5 things in my life that consume my thoughts the most, what does that include? Does that include people? Does that include things? And I think at different times in my life, I can look back and say, it's probably been better, been more towards people than it has been towards more things. But sometimes in my life, it's been more towards things. Like the things of this world have in my life consumed my thoughts a lot of times. And so it's really caused me, I think, as I look at this, to really look at the way that I look at the riches that I have, because I have been blessed, and I think living in America, we have these opportunities that other people don't have, and it just really caused me to think about how I'm using my money, how I'm using the things that God gives me, and be a lot more considerate about the things that I have and the things that I use. Am I laying up for myself treasures on earth, or am I laying for myself treasures in heaven? Am I living in luxury and self-indulgence, or am I using the things God has given me to further the kingdom and help others? And I can tell you, for me, this was a very uncomfortable 6 verses. And James has really kept me uncomfortable the entirety of the book. I think he's just kind of like saving it up, and he's like, I'm going to make you a little uncomfortable in chapter 1. I'll make you a little bit more uncomfortable in chapter 2. I think he just keeps building and building and building with my comfort level. Maybe that's just me, but there's just a lot of things that as I read through James really causes me to look inwardly at my heart and my motives, and I hope that's been something that you've been able to look at too. You may be a little further along in it than I am, but it's something that really is challenging. I think this in particular is a big challenge. For me and maybe for other Christian Americans. So as we look at this week, I really strongly consider you to continue to read James 5:1-6. Pray that the Lord's will is done, specifically in your finances, because that's something again that we have involvement in. And so again, if God has changed your heart, then He's going to change the way we look at finances and the way we use our finances. And then think about the resources that you have currently. And how you can use those to help those in need, whether that's brethren, certainly I think that's the priority, but also other people in the world, and how we can be a good example to the world around us and show God's love and light towards others in the way that we spend our money, because it does need to look a little different than those in the world, how we use our funds and how we use our blessing. So I hope James didn't step on your toes too terribly much as he did for me. So. Any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, complaints? Take those too.
Daniel,
I don't know if anybody else. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is Larry. I think that any Christian that's earnestly trying to do what they believe is right has to struggle with these verses, because like you said in the beginning, those of us living in this country are so blessed, so much greater than most of the rest of the world. So it is a struggle, I think, to know if we are giving enough, helping enough, using our resources and substance in the way that we should. And if we look back at Matthew 19, like we did, the Lord said, if you're going to be perfect, sell what you've got and give it to the poor. I don't know how many of us would be willing to do that right now. It's a struggle.
Thank you for saying that.
It is certainly. I think it's one of the greatest things I struggle with as I look back upon my life, as I pray every day. One of the things I think about a lot is this idea of stewardship. That's what we've really been talking about all night, is the idea of stewardship and what the Bible has to say about that. Being good stewards. Have I? How do we know if we have? And what do we need to change? Seems to me the big difference between the man who loves riches and lives in self-indulgence and a rich man like Abraham, the difference between Abraham and Nebuchadnezzar, I guess I might say, it seems to me is humility, isn't it? Being willing to humble yourself and realize, and that's the problem Nebuchadnezzar had. Look at the great palace I built. Look at the big city I built. How great am I? Mac Davis sang a song one time. It's hard to be humble when you're as good as I am. And it is, the richer you get, the more you think, well, look what I've accomplished. And we have to always realize that every single thing we have belongs to God.
Absolutely true. What else? What are some other things? What are some other thoughts? I appreciate you guys speaking up.
Daniel?
Yes, sir.
Just one quick comment. I think Larry's right. I know him pretty well, and I think he knows me pretty well. Neither one of us would be surprised to know if the other one is concerned about this. You think about whether or not, that passage, to him that knoweth be good, doeth not to him that is sin, whether you've done all you can do. And I just want to say that one of the things that we are told to pray for, we learned it early on, is wisdom. And giving money away sometimes in order to satisfy or soothe our conscience is not necessarily the answer either. There's some wisdom that plays into all this. And the more that we possess and the more we own, the more wisdom we need when you think about it. We can't on one side be gorging on all the pleasures of life. But the flip side of that, there's nothing wrong with enjoying life. In fact, we're told to do that in Ecclesiastes. So where's the fairness in how you satisfy your own self, and at the same time you become the servant that we just were talking about a moment ago? How do you satisfy all that? Well, I just think each one of us we got to make sure that we're using good wisdom the best that we can, and pray to God that we'll continue to have it. And if we're ever at a point where we're unwilling to help somebody who needs either food or clothing, then I think that's when we bring ourselves into question. Because when you look at those who are wanting in the New Testament, even during the time of wilderness wanderings, what did God give the people during that time? He gave them clothes that wouldn't wear out and food to eat. And that's what Paul told Timothy, that we need to be responsible. But Jesus said that we need to be willing to give food and a coat to somebody who needs it. We don't owe people anything else. So there needs to be wisdom in all this. It's hard. There's no way that I would ever try to accuse somebody of being unfair with how they handle their money and sharing it with others, because it's a challenge for all of us. That's just the truth.
I think another thing that's kind of come to my head and come to my mind is just the intentionality. One of the things I think in my life, just, historically, I've always just kind of not wanted to look at my bank account, or not really wanted to know how much I have in my bank or not. Not really want to be, not necessarily in control of my finances, but it just was something that I knew that I had, but I wasn't very intentional with it. Sometimes I didn't know where my money was going. And so something that I think has really helped Brittany and I is doing things like setting a budget, knowing where every, one of my dollars go, really helps and allows us to see where we are spending our money, where we have opportunity to look at whether there's a need or something along those lines, whether it's giving to the Lord or giving those things. And, I certainly don't want to, there's other ways that we can give, certainly, than just of our riches. There's time, and there's other things that we can give. But I think having an intentionality and having a knowledge of the things that we do have, I think kind of goes along with what Danny had said about good stewardship, is knowing these things and knowing what we do have and what we don't. I guess to Ross's point, you don't want to just just give aimlessly or give of what you don't have.
Well, if you give it all away, if you give everything away and you don't have anything at all and give it to the poor, now you're poor. And somebody's going to have to give to you. Mm-hmm. Is that what the Lord's saying? I think that's an exaggeration. I think it's an extreme. And I think what Jesus is doing is using extreme to make a point. But we have a responsibility to make sure that people are fed if they need food, and clothing if they give it. We are not obligated. Neither does Jesus instruct us or encourages us to go broke in the doing of it so that we become needy ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's wisdom in all this, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there certainly is. And I think, if we get nothing else out of what James said, I at least want you to get this, because this is something I really have to remind myself every day of, just how dangerous of a temptation riches can be, how dangerous money can be if we don't have the right perspective. That money never becomes a love of money or things like that. Because when I just see all these warnings in Scripture, when I see James give these warnings, when I see Jesus provide these warnings, say things like, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven, like that stands out. And so, I've got to continue to remind myself of the danger that riches can possess if I don't have God at the center of that, and have God certainly involved in that, with asking for wisdom on how to use my money or use the things that I'm given to. So, and that's a really tight line to walk too, because we're used to it. In our lives, we're used to it. We're used to seeing this, standard of living that we have. And so it's something that I have to really remind myself. And when I look at James is just, right. Just really hits me square in the nose with that. Anything else? Any other comments or anything? Well, y'all, I really appreciate everyone's comments and your attention. You know, I haven't ended the class like this, but I do want to encourage you to think of one thing because of this text you can change this week. I mean, I've been meaning to say that everyone. It's in the lesson notes, but think about that too. So next week we will be looking at James chapter 5. We'll be reading verses 7 through 12. So we're reading 5 verses there as James is looking at patience and suffering, and so we'll be studying about that, and then the following week we'll conclude with verses 13 through 19. So, so Brother Larry, would you mind dismissing us in prayer this evening? And we'll conclude.
Sure. But Heavenly Father, we are blessed in so many ways. We are blessed with the presence of the Spirit and the Word that's been provided for us so that we can have understanding of what you would have us to do. We're thankful, dear Lord, for all those who are willing to teach and to study that Word and seek the truth. We're grateful, dear Lord, for the possibilities and that we have right now of continuing to study your Word as this pandemic takes us into terrible directions. We pray, dear Lord, that those who are affected by a lack of knowledge will one day have an understanding of what your will is so that they too can participate as fellow Christians. We ask that you be with us now as we go through this week and keep us safe from harm, and if it's your will, return us again to our worship service on Sunday. And this we pray through your Son. Amen.
Amen.